This passage about the feeding of the 5,000 is the only story found in all four Gospels, so it is one of the better known stories. It is actually found twice in Matthew, once here and once again in verse 15, where the two stories essentially bookend a series of stories about what the kingdom of heaven looks like in practical ways. During these stories, Jesus controls the wind and the rain as he walks on water. He heals and he welcomes the Canaanite woman and shows us all that welcome is not often what we expect it to be. Interestingly, this story, the story of the feeding of the 5,000, with its total of 6 occurrences across the Gospels, makes it 3 times more prevalent in the Gospels than the birth narrative. And to be honest, the retelling by the particular authors is different, but still more similar than the 2 birth narratives. But I'm going to leave that question of why that is to another day, or for you to speculate on at another time. Today, I want to talk specifically about the placement of this story as we find it in Matthew, which is similar to Mark, but different from both Luke and John. To do this, we need to look at what happened before the story. And when we do, we notice 2 things. This story takes place after Jesus' hometown has essentially thrown him out, and after a banquet where King Herod has quite literally served up John the Baptist's head on a platter. Today, I want to put it to you that the purpose for the particular placement of the story in Matthew's Gospel is to contrast, through practical example, the radical hospitality of God's kingdom as exemplified by Jesus feeding the 5,000, as opposed to the hospitality, if we can call it that, of the earthly kingdoms of Jesus' time. Both the earthly kingdoms represented by politics and power, such as Herod's kingdoms, and the earthly kingdoms we create in our own homes and in our own neighbourhoods, namely the example of Jesus' experience in his hometown of Nazareth. The thing I love about the use of these 2 examples for the earthly kingdoms is that it stops us from disassociating. It stops us from thinking that the kingdom is much distant from us. We're not so distant from the small kingdoms of our destructive social orders built up amongst our own families and our social groupings. So what are the clear differences that we can see in the kingdom views that we are presented with? Well, I think the first thing is that the welcome that we offer as Christians doesn't come with a particular set of rules for how people we offer welcome to should act. And thankfully, it also doesn't ask us to conform to those rules. It just asks us to welcome. The problem that Jesus found in his hometown was not that he was not welcome. If he had come home and he had conformed to what his community had expected him to be, the loyal son of the carpenter who accepted his place in the social order, that probably would have been fine. The problem was that he didn't. He came home and he taught in the synagogue, and what he said clearly had value because the text tells us that the people were amazed. It was then and only then that he was kicked out, because he was something different from the preconceived idea of what he should be. And that meant, sadly, that in that place, the gift that he had no effect. Makes sense, doesn't it? If we don't welcome in a way that welcomes the diverse gifts of others, if we don't welcome in a way that acknowledges and values the diverse gifts of others, they will have no impact on us. And sadly, we all miss out, not just the person who was rejected. For Herod, the banquet he hosted was planned in the usual way of a state banquet, and it had a particular purpose. It was to celebrate him, his birthday. The guests were invited and they were carefully chosen, and there was clearly a lot of rules and social protocols that Herod had to abide by that sadly, even though he was king, he didn't have a lot of choice over. We're told really clearly through this story that Herod's will was not really his own, but it was strongly influenced by those around him, his niece, his brother's wife, the crowds. There is the distinct feel of false power here, even though his title and name tell us that he has power. He doesn't. It is a power based on acting in a particular way. Herod had to act in a certain way, regardless of whether it was right or wrong, to maintain his rule. Again, there is a whole lot of rules around how Herod welcomes, and these rules both limit the freedom to be ourselves and to choose for ourselves, and we assumed limited those who are there, because just like Herod, they would have been subject to these particular ways of being. Jesus had not planned his banquet. He had actually tried to get away from the people. We assume to grieve both his beloved cousin and the rejection of his neighbours, and yet the people came anyway. He didn't invite them. He didn't choose who they were, nor did he tell them how to act. They simply sat with him. They listened to his story. These were not invited people. They were not carefully chosen. They were definitely not the elite of society. In fact, they were probably the total opposite, as we are told that many of them were sick, but they were not sent away, which would have been the sensible choice, particularly when it came to feeding them. So I think the first thing that we learn about this banquet of God is that the rules of welcome, the social conventions of our homes and our cultures, don't really matter much when it comes to God's welcome. We can hold them loosely, not get rid of them, but hold them as less important than the welcome itself, because the truth is that we often don't get to prepare before we are asked to show hospitality, and we can't always know the particular type of hospitality or welcome that is needed for the people who we welcome. We want to leave open the possibility that the people we welcome are different to what we expect, and they will need different things from us, and conversely, they will actually give us different gifts, just as Jesus did in his hometown. The reality is that our rules of welcome on hospitality, held too tightly, means we might miss the opportunity to give of ourselves and to receive from others. The other thing we're reminded of here is that in God's kingdom, the timing of when we are asked to welcome can actually be pretty ordinary. As I have already mentioned, Herod got to choose when and where he got to hold his party. He got to plan. Jesus didn't. The reality of the kingdom of God is we don't always control to whom we share our faith and our possibility of people of faith. That's actually left up to God. And to be honest, that is sometimes a pretty scary thought. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for Jesus, rejected by his neighbours and then grieving the gruesome death of his cousin, suddenly to find himself surrounded by thousands and thousands of people. But you know what? The beautiful thing here is that the text reminds us that even though welcome happens when we are totally unprepared for it and least expect it, even when we don't want it, we actually have all we need to offer, as long as we trust that what we have is enough. The miracle here, I think, is not just that Jesus was able to feed all those people, but that he was able to heal and teach in spite of it all. In spite of his weariness, in spite of his sense of rejection and his grief, he was able to be all that the gathered people needed. He was enough. Whatever he said in that moment was enough. Whatever food he could provide was enough. And you know what? I have a bit of a theory about this one. I think that was not because he was enough, but because he and the disciples were enough. They were enough with him together. They must have interacted with the people and loved them and cared for them, and ultimately the disciples fed them. This was not a one-man show, but a community that worked together, sharing what they had for the good of all. And my guess is, if I am honest, is that the feeding of the 5,000 was not really a miracle. I actually think that once they started sharing, others on that hill did too, and ultimately they found that the combined smallness of the few who had food became a great banquet for all. This is in total contrast to Herod. Rather than giving from the little he had, the lot he had, the example that Herod offers is literally the total offering of someone else. He literally serves up John the Baptist as a meal on a platter extravagantly, and I am sure with a good deal of flourish and theatre. In this moment, Herod's welcoming is at total contrast to Jesus, is at absolutely no cost to himself. He doesn't offer anything of himself. He actually gives something that is not his to give, someone else's life. And he gives the ideal excuse for this treachery by blaming the obligation on someone else. His offering is entirely someone else's sacrifice, namely John the Baptist. And this is both the birthday gift he offers and the banquet for the feast. Jesus' welcome is totally the opposite of Herod's. It is simple, it is non-extravagant. There are no fancy platters of any kind. There is just a hill, some grass, some bread and some fish. Everything given as part of his welcome is his own to give together with those around him. And can I remind you that the thing that Jesus gives are really simple, that we all have. Kind words, welcome, a listening ear, and the simplest of food shared. Nothing more, nothing less, but the most extravagant feast. Truth is, there is nothing radical about God's hospitality. It is actually really simple. It doesn't need planning. In fact, sometimes scarily, there is no time to plan, but we are safe in the knowledge that if we are open to its transformation and opportunity to be surprised by what we will find, we won't need that time, because we will discover that we have everything we have. Kind and healing words, a simple place to gather, and friends new and old who will share that banquet.